All right, let's jump into another deep dive. Today, we're taking a look at some really interesting research on the ABCD study.
The Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study.
That's the one, but we'll just stick with ABCD for short.
Makes sense.
So this research is all about how scientists are using genotype data from the study.
Basically, information about people's genes.
Exactly. And they're using it to get a better grasp on how our brains develop.
Which is a pretty big deal.
Yeah, and it's not just about the genes themselves. It's about how researchers are using, well, some really clever techniques to make sure their findings are as accurate as possible.
Minimizing bias, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And our source for this deep dive is this research article. It's called Genotype Data and Derived Genetic Instruments of Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study for Better Understanding of Human Brain Development.
Quite a mouthful.
It is. So maybe we should start with the basics. What exactly is the ABCD study?
Well, it's not your average research project, that's for sure.
How so?
It's huge. It's tracking the brain development and mental well-being of thousands of kids.
Thousands.
Yeah, and they start following them when they're just 9 or 10 years old.
Wow.
And they follow them all the way into adulthood.
So we're talking years and years of data.
At least a decade, they're hoping.
That's incredible. It's like a time machine for understanding the brain.
Exactly.
But I have to ask, why is the genetic data so important? I mean, it's just one piece of the puzzle, right?
Well, think of it this way. Genes are like the blueprint for your brain.
The instruction manual.
Exactly. But how those instructions are read and used, that's where the environment comes in.
Okay, I see. So it's like having the ingredients for a cake. You need the right oven temperature, the right mixing techniques to get the best result.
Exactly. And by studying genes alongside all the things that make up a person's environment, the researchers in the ABCD study are getting a much clearer picture of how all these forces shape who we become.
So it's kind of like nature versus nurture, but instead of picking a side, they're looking at how they work together.
Exactly.
That's fascinating. But how do they even get this genetic data?
It all starts with, well, something surprisingly simple. Saliva or blood samples.
Oh, okay.
And then they use a technique called genotyping to analyze those samples. Imagine like scanning a person's entire genetic code, looking for tiny variations that could affect how their brain develops. That's genotyping.
So it sounds pretty high-tech, but I'm guessing it's not as easy as it sounds, right?
Oh, definitely not. There's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes to make sure the data is accurate. They have to be really careful. For example, they actually process the blood and saliva samples in separate batches.
Separate batches? Why'd they do that?
It was to make sure that any tiny differences between blood and saliva didn't mess up the results. You wouldn't want the way they handled the samples to create fake differences in the data. They were really paying attention to detail.
That makes sense. And speaking of differences, the world is incredibly diverse, right? How do researchers deal with that in a study like this?
Well, that's one of the most amazing things about the ABCD study.
How?
They went out of their way to recruit a diverse group of participants, people from all sorts of backgrounds. And the mix of people in the study reflects the makeup of the U.S. population as a whole.
I see. So instead of assuming everyone's brain develops in the same way, they're acknowledging that different people might have slightly different paths depending on their background.
That's a great way to put it.
But doesn't that diversity make things even more complex?
It definitely adds complexity, but it's a good kind of complexity.
Okay, so how does it work?
You see, there's this thing called population structure.
Population structure.
It basically means that people from different ancestral backgrounds, different parts of the world, have slight genetic differences.
Okay.
And if the researchers don't take those differences into account, it could lead to some pretty misleading results.
So it's like trying to understand a whole orchestra by listening to only one instrument. You need to hear all the instruments to get the full picture.
That's a fantastic analogy. And that's why researchers use something called genetic principal components.
Genetic what now?
Principal components.
Yeah.
Or PCs for short. You can think of them like filters that help to separate the real signal from the genetic noise caused by those differences in ancestry.
I think I'm starting to get it. So it's like they're using these PCs to fine-tune their view of the brain.
Exactly. They're getting a clearer picture.
This is all really interesting. But before we move on, I remember reading something about unexpected family ties in the data.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Researchers found some unexpected relatedness among the participants.
Like they were related without knowing it.
Exactly. It goes beyond the twin pairs that were intentionally included in the study.
Wait, so they found hidden relatives in the data? How is that even possible?
Well, they used a special tool called PC Relate.
PC Relate.
Yeah, it's pretty sophisticated. It helped them uncover these hidden connections.
Wow, that's incredible. But what happens when those surprise relatives pop up? Does it mess things up for the research?
It can. If it's not handled properly, it can skew the results. You see, when you're trying to figure out how common certain genetic traits are, having a bunch of relatives in the mix can give you a misleading picture.
Okay, I see. So it's like there's this hidden bias that could creep into the research if they're not careful.
Exactly. But by using PC-Relate to find and account for these hidden relationships, the researchers are making sure their findings are as accurate as possible.
So it's all about making sure the results are reliable no matter what surprises pop up along the way.
Exactly.
This is already so fascinating, but I have a feeling it gets even more interesting. What about those rare genetic variations you mentioned?
You're picking up on all the right threads. Remember how we talked about how diverse the ABCD study participants are? Well, that diversity gives researchers the chance to study rarer gene variations, those that are more common in certain populations and often get missed in smaller studies.
So it's like they're finally getting a chance to explore those less traveled parts of the genetic map.
That's a great way to put it. And these rarer variations could hold crucial clues about why some people are more susceptible to certain conditions, those that affect the brain. They could even help us develop treatments that are more tailored to a person's unique genetic makeup.
That sounds like the future of medicine, being able to predict and prevent problems based on your genes. That's amazing.
It has incredible potential.
But before we get too ahead of ourselves, I have one more question about something I read. Genotype imputation and the top PMED reference panel. What was that all about?
Genotype imputation. Oh, it's like having a puzzle master on the research team.
A puzzle master.
It's a way to fill in missing pieces of genetic information using a massive reference database called Top PMED.
So TOPPM is like a giant library of genetic information.
It is. And by comparing the data they have to this huge database, they can make educated guesses about the missing pieces.
So they're basically using the power of big data to enhance their genetic map.
Exactly. It gives them an even clearer picture of how genes might be influencing brain development.
My mind is buzzing with all this information. Yeah. It's amazing to think how much we can learn from saliva and blood samples, but I'm guessing there's still more to uncover, right? Where are we headed next in this deep dive?
You're right. We're just getting started. Next, we'll dig deeper into how they're using this genetic data to make all sorts of research within the ABCD study more accurate, not just the genetic studies.
So we'll see how they're using those genetic tools in action.
Exactly. We'll explore genetic instruments and their role in understanding the developing brain.
This is already mind-blowing, and I can't wait to learn more.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the ABCD study. My head is still spinning from all the amazing things we've learned so far. It's incredible how researchers are using this genetic data to understand the brain. And I'm especially interested in the idea of using this data to make all the research even more accurate.
It's a real game changer. I mean, for years, researchers have been trying to figure out how to deal with these hidden biases that can sneak into studies. Like the population structure and the unexpected relatedness we've been talking about.
Yeah, those hidden connections.
Exactly. And the ABCD study is showing us how we can actually use genetic data to, kind of fine-tune our research lens.
It's like using a filter to remove all the noise and just see the clear signal, right?
Exactly.
Before the break, you mentioned something about genetic instruments. Can you explain what those are and how they work?
Sure. Imagine you're trying to study, say, the relationship between screen time and attention span in teenagers.
We know that things like socioeconomic factors can play a role. Kids from wealthier families might have more access to devices, right? But what if you could use genetic information to statistically account for those differences?
That's where these genetic instruments come in.
Exactly. It's not about studying the genes themselves. It's about using them as tools to control for other factors that could be messing with the results.
I see. So it's about getting a clearer picture of what's really going on.
Exactly. And the paper we're looking at has a great example of how researchers use those genetic PCs, those filters we talked about, to untangle the relationship between certain brain imaging features and socioeconomic outcomes.
Okay, tell me more about that.
So let's say researchers see that certain brain imaging features are more common in kids from lower socioeconomic backgrounds.
Okay.
Now, this could be because those features are influenced by environmental factors related to poverty. But it could also be because those features are just more common in certain ancestral groups that also happen to be more prevalent in lower socioeconomic brackets.
So the genetic PCs help to tease apart those two possibilities.
Right. They help to determine if the brain imaging features are actually linked to those socioeconomic factors, or if it's just a reflection of shared ancestry.
It's like using a more powerful lens to see the true picture, isn't it?
Exactly. By including the genetic PCs in the analysis, researchers can be more confident that the relationships they observe are real and not just because of population structure.
It's all about being as precise as possible.
Right.
But this is just one example of how these genetic instruments can be used, right? What are some other ways they're being used in the ABCD study?
Well, another really cool application is in twin studies. Identical twins share the same genes, while fraternal twins share only about half.
Right.
And by comparing those two types of twins, researchers can start to figure out the relative roles that genes and environment play in different traits and behaviors.
So if identical twins are more alike on a particular trait than fraternal twins, that suggests genes might be more important.
Exactly. And in the ABCD study, they're using these twin comparisons to look at everything from cognitive abilities and personality to things like risk factors for mental health disorders.
This is groundbreaking stuff. It feels like we're finally getting a better understanding of this whole nature versus nurture debate.
I agree. And it's scientifically rigorous, too.
But what about the bigger picture? What does this mean for the future of brain research?
I think the ABCD study is really paving the way for a more precise and personalized approach to understanding the brain. We might even be able to use genetic information to tailor interventions and treatments to individuals.
That's amazing. Instead of a one-size-fits-all approach, we could have treatments that are specifically designed for you based on your genes.
Exactly.
It's exciting, but also a bit overwhelming to think about all the possibilities.
I agree. Like any powerful tool, we have to use this knowledge responsibly. But I think the ABCD study is doing things the right way. Their focus on diversity and their rigorous methods are setting a high standard.
That's good to hear. It sounds like they're really thinking about the bigger picture.
They are.
Now, we've been talking about how this genetic data helps to improve the accuracy of the research, but what about the actual findings themselves?
Oh, that's a great question.
What are some of the things they've learned from the ABCD studies so far?
Well, one thing they found is that certain genetic variations might influence how the brain responds to stress. And that could be really important for understanding and treating things like anxiety and depression.
Wow, so we're not just talking about abstract genetic concepts. This has real-world implications for people's mental health.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just mental health. They're also using the ABCD data to study the genetic underpinnings of things like memory, attention, and language skills.
So it could change the way we think about education and learning.
Absolutely.
This is incredible. It feels like we're just at the beginning of a whole new era of brain research.
I think you're right. As the ABCD study continues to collect data and researchers delve deeper into this complex interplay between genes, environment, and the brain, I think we can expect even more groundbreaking discoveries in the years to come.
This has been an amazing journey so far, and I can't wait to see what the future holds. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's take a moment to think about what we've learned today.
Okay.
What are some of the key takeaways you want our listeners to remember from this deep dive?
Well, I think the most important message is that the ABCD study isn't just about advancing science. It's about understanding ourselves, our kids, and future generations. By really unraveling this complex relationship between genes, environment, and the developing brain, this study is giving us tools to improve lives.
That's a really powerful message.
It is.
It sounds like this research has the potential to not only change how we understand the brain, but also to shape our society in positive ways.
Absolutely.
This has been a fantastic conversation, but I feel like there's still more to explore. What else is on the horizon for our deep dive?
Well, we've talked about the importance of diversity in research and the power of those genetic instruments. But there's one more piece of the puzzle we haven't really touched on yet. That surprising amount of relatedness they found among the participants.
Oh yeah, those unexpected family ties. We only briefly mentioned them earlier. It's like there's a hidden network within the study itself.
Exactly.
So what are the implications of all these surprise relatives? Does it mess things up, or could it actually be helpful?
That's a great question. And it's exactly what we'll be exploring in the final part of our deep dive. We'll take a closer look at hidden relatedness and what it means for understanding the developing brain.
I can't wait. This has been an incredible journey so far. I'm hooked. Welcome back. We're wrapping up our deep dive into the ABCD study. It's amazing to think that something as simple as saliva or blood can tell us so much about how our brains develop. Before the break, we were talking about those hidden family connections in the study data. What's the deal with that?
It's like a mystery, isn't it? Remember that PC Relate tool we talked about? The one that helps researchers find hidden relatives?
Yeah.
Well, they found out that these unexpected relationships are more common than you'd think.
So tell me more about what they found and why it's important.
Imagine you're putting together a giant jigsaw puzzle of the brain.
Yeah.
And suddenly you find out some of the pieces you thought were unique are actually from the same part of the picture.
Oh, I see. So it's like having duplicate puzzle pieces. That could really mess up the picture if you don't realize they're connected.
Exactly. And this isn't just some theory. It has real consequences for how we understand research findings. Let's say researchers are looking at a trait like impulsivity, and they find it tends to run in families.
Okay.
Now, if they don't account for this hidden relatedness, they might think genes play a bigger role in impulsivity than they actually do.
Because some of that family resemblance could be from shared genes, but some could just be because they grew up in a similar environment.
Right. So by taking these hidden relationships into account, they get a more accurate picture of how genes and environment work together to shape things like impulsivity.
It's like they're adding an extra layer of accuracy to their analysis.
Exactly. They want to make sure their findings are as solid as possible.
This hidden relatedness, could it be a good thing too? I mean, could it help us understand the brain even better?
You're right. It's not just a problem. It's also a unique opportunity. Think about it. Having all these hidden relatives in the study lets researchers explore how genes and environment interact within families.
It's like a built-in experiment.
Exactly. They can compare siblings raised together to those raised apart. Or they can look at how the influence of genes on a trait might change as kids grow up.
It's like having a whole new set of tools to study this nature versus nurture idea. This is all so incredible, but where do we go from here? What's next for the ABCD study?
The amazing thing about a study like this is it's constantly evolving. They're still gathering data. And with each new piece of information, researchers can ask and answer more complex questions. We're really just at the beginning.
I'm excited to see what discoveries they make in the future. And this deep dive has really shown me that science is more than just facts. It's about exploring, being curious, and being ready for the unexpected.
I couldn't agree more. The ABCD study shows what we can accomplish when scientists work together. And it reminds us of the amazing potential of the human brain.
This has been an incredible journey. Thank you so much for being our guide through this fascinating world of the ABCD study.
It's been my pleasure. And to everyone listening, remember, this is just the beginning. Keep asking questions, keep learning, and stay curious about science. There's so much more to discover.
Well said. That wraps up our deep dive for today. We hope you enjoyed it and that you learned something new about the amazing human brain. Until next time.